Picture this, we are barely 4 months into what should be a blissful union, and instead of a honeymoon suite, I found myself checking into a rehab facility for a 90-day stint. We were completely blind to the storm that was about to hit us. Nicole didn't just ignore the gossip. She silenced the doubt, screaming in her own mind to stand by her man. She chose unconditional love over self-preservation. And somehow, against all odds, we find ourselves standing here tonight, 18 long years down the road. It was April of 2024 when Keith Urban stood beneath the glaring stage lights, pouring his heart out with a confession that nobody in the audience saw coming. At the ripe age of 58, he hailed Nicole Kidman not just as his wife, but as the very anchor of his existence, the one soul who dragged him back from the edge of an abyss that by all rights should have claimed his life. And yet, in a twist that defies all logic, less than 18 months after that public declaration of undying devotion, the marriage was reportedly finished. There were no splashy scandal headlines screaming from the grocery store racks, no public meltdowns caught on camera, just a deafening, heavy silence. So what on earth transpired between that heartfelt confession and the final goodbye? Why is the ugly truth only bubbling to the surface now? We need to go back to the beginning, to the 4-month implosion that started it all. For most couples, the honeymoon phase is a lengthy period of bliss lasting years, but for Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman, that window of happiness slammed shut in exactly 120 days. A mere 4 months after their storybook wedding in Sydney back in 2006, the marriage didn't just experience a wobble or a bump in the road, it completely detonated. This wasn't a quiet disagreement behind closed doors. It was a full-scale, dramatic intervention that demanded a brutal, life-altering choice almost immediately after they had exchanged their I do's. This is the critical chapter that most glossy magazine covers conveniently skip over. We are talking about October 2006, barely a heartbeat into their new life together. It was Nicole Kidman who orchestrated a desperate intervention for Keith Urban. This isn't some baseless rumour or a piece of gossip leaked by a disgruntled staffer. Keith himself has gone on record confirming the gritty details time and time again over the years. Close family members, trusted friends and medical professionals all convened to confront a terrifying relapse into addiction, a demon that had been stalking him long before he ever stood at the altar. The very man who had just walked down the aisle in a tuxedo was suddenly staring down the barrel of a grim reality: get immediate help or you might not survive to see your first anniversary. Urban later characterised that moment with a single heavy word that still sends shivers down the spine, Smithereens. In his own raw recounting, his life didn't just crack or bend under pressure, it absolutely shattered into a million pieces. That revealing choice of words surfaced years later during a deeply emotional AFI tribute dedicated to Nicole. He didn't say it during a scandalous tell-all interview or while doing damage control for the press. Standing before the creme de la creme of Hollywood, Keith confessed that his entire universe had blown apart just months into the marriage, and the woman everyone advised him to release was the only one who refused to let go. Now, this is the part of the narrative where things get incredibly uncomfortable and complex. Because if you look at it through any rational lens, this was the precise moment Nicole Kidman should have cut her losses and walked away. Her inner circle was reportedly begging her to run for the hills. Her advisors painted a grim picture of the heavy toll loving an addict takes. Statistically speaking, an intervention this early in a marriage is rarely a harbinger of stability. Instead, it usually signals a future riddled with the anxiety of potential relapses, immense emotional labour, and years of agonising uncertainty. She had her reputation, her heart, and her future on the line with absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. Yet she doubled down on love. That choice carried a psychological burden that is far too often overlooked. Deciding to stay in that chaos doesn't mean you're being optimistic. It means you are prioritising responsibility and duty over your own personal safety and peace of mind. It means coming to terms with the fact that your marriage might never resemble normal, that every moment of joy is shadowed by constant vigilance, and that keeping your partner alive could secretly become your full-time occupation. Keith checked himself into rehab for a grueling 3-month stretch. Think about that. 3 out of the first 4 months of their union were spent in isolation defined by locked facility doors, intense therapy sessions, and a level of internal reckoning that most partners don't have to confront for decades, if ever. When most people reminisce about their honeymoon, they talk about beaches and sunsets. Keith Urban's version involved harsh detox protocols and painful withdrawal symptoms. And hanging over it all was the crushing fear that the marriage might have already breathed its last breath before it even had a chance to truly begin. What is rarely discussed is how this early trauma set the fundamental tone for every single thing that came afterwards. It created a cocktail of gratitude, immense guilt, heavy dependence, and fierce devotion. Keith has repeatedly painted Nicole as the guardian angel who saved his life, and we have to understand that this specific framing is significant. When one partner takes on the dual role of spouse and saviour, the emotional equilibrium shifts in ways that might feel romantic initially but can become an unbearable weight as the years roll on. In subsequent interviews, Keith has been candid about the sheer terror he felt that Nicole would pack her bags. He spoke of how her steadfast decision to remain by his side completely rewired his concept of what love is. While that level of devotion can certainly spark a personal transformation, it also generates a quiet, relentless pressure to live up to a standard that feels nearly impossible to maintain. When someone stands by you at your absolute lowest point, how do you ever stop striving to prove you were worth that sacrifice? This wasn't a relationship that gently eased into the deep waters. It was thrown headfirst into the raging deep end from day one. The public was treated to images of glamorous red carpets and glittering award shows, but behind the curtain, the bedrock of their bond was being laid in the middle of a crisis, not during a time of peace. And that brings us to the nagging question that hides beneath the surface of this romance. If a marriage is forged in the fires of an intervention rather than the warmth of a honeymoon, does it build unbreakable loyalty, or does it create a debt ledger that can never truly be balanced? Because if those initial 4 months dictated everything that followed, what happens when that gratitude fades into emotional distance and mere survival is no longer enough glue to keep two people attached? Now we must summon the ghost of Laura Sigler. Before Nicole ever entered the picture, there was another woman who witnessed the raw, unfiltered version of Keith that the world was never meant to see. Long before the flashbulbs, the rehab redemption stories, and the meticulously rehearsed interviews, Keith Urban spent 8 formative years alongside Laura Sigler. That obscure, often overlooked romance actually holds the skeleton key to understanding the mechanics of his high-profile marriage today, revealing truths that fly under the radar. You see, Laura Sigler wasn't some polished A-lister or red carpet regular. She existed completely outside the ruthless machinery of the entertainment industry. Her path crossed with Keith's way back in the gritty 1990s, a time when he was just another hungry artist, scrapping for a break, riddled with instability and desperate to carve out an identity. Their connection endured for the better part of a decade, a span of time that in the volatile, fast-paced ecosystem of the music business might as well be an entire century of loyalty. Throughout those formative years, Laura had a front row seat to a peculiar construction project. She watched Keith meticulously assemble a charming public persona that stood in stark, confusing contrast to the troubled man sharing her living space. In the years since, Keith himself has dropped the veil, offering a startling admission about exactly what was going on in his head during that chaotic era. He branded himself with a brutal label, a hypocrite, and he didn't use the term lightly or casually. He meant it in the most visceral, unsettling sense imaginable. He was pouring his soul into ballads, celebrating undying devotion, steadfast loyalty, and raw emotional truth, all while failing miserably to embody those virtues behind closed doors. The melodies peddled a perfect fantasy, but the reality was a chaotic, tangled mess. It was a toxic cocktail of chemical dependency, crippling insecurity, cold emotional withdrawal, and those relentless, exhausting cycles of self-sabotage that refused to let him go. Laura spotted the hairline fractures in the foundation years before the adoring public caught even a glimpse. She lived in that vast silent chasm separating the charismatic superstar on the stage from the fragile human being who walked off it. Understanding that disconnect is crucial because when Keith finally walked away from Laura, the breakup wasn't packaged as some headline-grabbing betrayal or a tabloid-worthy scandal. It simply evaporated into silence. 8 long years dissolved into the ether without a press release or a dramatic narrative, which ironically is exactly how some of the most life-altering connections tend to wither away. There was no grand finale for the audience to dissect, no romantic mythology to cling to just avoid. However, Laura didn't just vanish into the background noise of history completely. Come 2006, when the media frenzy erupted over Keith Urban. Tying the knot with Nicole Kidman, Laura Sigler stepped out of the shadows to do something remarkably uncharacteristic. She didn't scream for attention or spew venom. Instead, she spoke with a calm, piercing clarity that was potent enough to make everyone pause and raise an eyebrow. She issued a sober warning: to love Keith was to sign up for loving a man who was simultaneously a breathtaking genius and a deeply fractured soul. It meant embracing a person capable of profound sincerity one moment and absolute self-destruction the next. Back then, the public and the press were quick to brush her words aside, labelling them as petty jealousy, just the sour grapes of a forgotten ex-girlfriend forced to watch her old flame marry Hollywood royalty. The story everyone wanted to believe was simple, neat and comforting. Keith had evolved past his demons and Nicole was the magical factor that made everything different. Everyone convinced themselves this time was the real deal. And to be fair, for a long stretch, the evidence supported the hope. Keith maintained his sobriety and couldn't stop singing Nicole's praises to anyone who would listen. He didn't just thank her. He publicly credited her with literally saving his life, repeating the sentiment so consistently it began to feel like a sacred ritual or a protective mantra. Every acceptance speech transformed into a gushing love letter, and every interview hammered home the same point. This was being sold as far more than a mere celebrity marriage. It was a grand, sweeping narrative of redemption. Yet this is exactly where the ghostly echo of Laura's warning refuses to fade. The hypocrite Keith described from the 1990s wasn't a man who lacked a belief in love. On the contrary, he believed in it with a burning intensity. His struggle was never the feeling itself, but the Herculean task of sustaining it once the adrenaline of the spotlight dimmed and the mundane routine of real life took over. He possessed the gift to articulate devotion in the most poetic terms imaginable, all while privately engaging in a brutal wrestling match with his own restlessness and crippling self-doubt. He was crushed by the pressure to actually be the noble man his lyrics described. That deeply ingrained psychological pattern didn't just magically evaporate the moment he found fame or exchanged vows. Instead of disappearing, it was merely managed, rigorously structured, and carefully contained within a new framework. While Nicole played a vastly different role than Laura, the underlying emotional mechanics bore a haunting resemblance. Laura had loved the man before he became an icon, whereas Nicole fell for him right as he was cementing his status as a legend. That crucial difference in timing purchased them valuable runway. It bought time, provided necessary stability, enforced structure, and supported his fragile sobriety. However, even that powerful love couldn't completely erase the inherent vibrating tension between the Keith the public adored and the private man still figuring it all out. When Laura cautioned that loving Keith required accepting his cycles, she wasn't forecasting tabloid scandals or illicit affairs. She was pointing a finger at something far quieter and more insidious. She was talking about the sheer emotional labour required to love a human being who is perpetually sprinting to outrun the darker parts of his own soul. And for years, Nicole appeared more than willing to shoulder that heavy burden. She consciously chose to lean into love even when every shred of cold logic would have screamed at her to turn around and run. She remained steadfast through the rehab stints, through the lonely voids of touring absences, and through the relentless pressure of being tethered to a man whose demons were never truly vanquished, only kept on a tight leash. In return for her sacrifice, Keith maintained a facade of absolute public perfection. And honestly, that is the specific detail that should give us pause, because maintaining a flawless image for nearly 2 decades is rarely a symptom of ease. That level of consistency is born from grueling effort, rigid discipline, active suppression of impulses, and the constant exhausting calculation of choosing the exact right words to say. He kept it up even when the roiling emotions underneath were incredibly complicated. Laura Sigler didn't try to pin a specific expiration date on their marriage. What she predicted was the inevitable struggle. And looking back through the lens of time, her cautionary words don't resonate with bitterness anymore. They sound strikingly, uncomfortably observant. The uncomfortable truth we might have to accept is that the man who once openly confessed to being a hypocrite may have simply mastered the art of concealing his contradictions more effectively. He learned how to embody the hero in his songs for the cameras, even if in the quiet of his own mind he was still negotiating a truce with the very same internal battles. So the real question here isn't whether Keith Urban underwent a change. The evidence is clear that he transformed dramatically. The pertinent question is whether a transformation rooted primarily in gratitude and a terrified fear of loss can actually sustain itself forever, especially once immediate survival is no longer the primary objective. And if the lingering ghost of Laura Sigler was correct about Keith Urban's true nature, then how on earth did he manage to keep the whole structure looking so pristine for 19 years? Enter the concept of the Jenga marriage. Back in 2015, Keith Urban dropped a specific word in conversation that probably should have played like a light-hearted joke, but it landed with a different weight. He explicitly described the reality of his domestic life with a single, precarious, proper noun, Jenga. It implies that one false move, one block, yanked out at the wrong second, and the entire tower could come crashing down. At the time, the public chuckled, writing it off as just a quirky metaphor for the chaos of conflicting schedules and celebrity stress. But reading it now, years down the line, that word feels less like a bit of self-deprecating humour and more like a hushed confession of fragility hiding right there in plain sight. You see, the game of Jenga isn't actually a test of how strong you are. It is a high-stakes lesson in maintaining equilibrium while everything threatens to topple over. Flash back to the mid-2010s and the narrative around Keith and Nicole was flawless. They were paraded around as the gold standard of Hollywood matrimony, enduring devoid of tabloid drama and possessing a stability that felt almost militant. However, when you start to peel back the layers and scrutinise the strict regulations they implemented to safeguard that harmony, a much more complex image begins to distort the view. This wasn't a union running on autopilot or easy affection. It appears to be a relationship that was meticulously architected to prevent a catastrophic structural failure. Consider, for instance, their rather infamous double shower protocol. Keith previously divulged that whenever their careers forced them apart, be it for lengthy concert tours or grueling film shoots, they committed to showering at the exact same hour, mimicking the routine regardless of the time zones separating them. The stated intent was to foster a sense of symbolic proximity, a method to bridge the physical gap between them. At a glance, it comes across as incredibly romantic, perhaps even a bit lyrical. Just two soulmates attempting to synchronise their daily rhythms despite the cruel realities of geography. Yet a more critical eye might interpret this quite differently, because rigid rituals of this magnitude rarely stem from a place of comfort or ease. They are usually born from deep-seated anxiety, from a desperate need to mitigate uncertainty, and a grasping attempt to control the connection when external forces are relentlessly trying to sever it. Then you have the other major pillar of their agreement, the absolute ban on text messaging. Keith went on record stating they deliberately abstained from texting because the medium is rife with pitfalls. Nuance evaporates, tone vanishes, and meaning gets twisted in the digital void. Consequently, they opted exclusively for voice calls or total radio silence. Once again, this was branded as a move toward intentionality, a mature, thoughtful, and refreshingly analog approach to modern love. But here lies the underlying friction. Sending a quick text isn't inherently hazardous in itself. It only becomes a minefield when there is a pervasive fear of being misunderstood, when every silence feels pregnant with doom and every syllable must be curated to ensure it doesn't trigger a spiral of insecurity. In a partnership grounded in rock-solid trust, a text message is merely a logistical tool. In a union built on fragile foundations, however, every SMS carries the weight of a potential crisis. And this is precisely where the power imbalance becomes too glaring to overlook. Since the inception of their romance, Keith has painted Nicole as his saviour, the anchor in his storm, the steady hand who bet on him when common sense dictated she should flee. That specific storytelling device elevated Nicole to a pedestal of emotional authority while relegating Keith to a permanent state of indebtedness. While gratitude is a noble sentiment, sustain it for decades and it morphs into a quiet, corrosive asymmetry within the dynamic. When one spouse is viewed as the sole reason the other is still breathing, the relationship shifts away from being purely about romantic love. It transforms into a job of maintenance, a constant effort to avoid letting down the person who rescued you from your lowest point, and a ceaseless need to prove their gamble wasn't a mistake. Keith frequently discussed the necessity of protecting their union. He spoke of being deliberate, of never taking their bond for granted, sentiments that are on paper entirely admirable. However, protective measures can effortlessly slide into suffocating pressure, and intentionality can quietly evolve into a form of self-surveillance. Analysed in isolation, every single rule they adhered to seems logical enough. Limiting digital noise, prioritising voice calls, establishing connection rituals, synchronising calendars, and practising radical transparency. But weave them all together, and you are left with a portrait of a marriage that demanded distinct, unwavering calibration every single day. This is the point where the Jenga analogy loses its charm. In that game, the tower remains upright only if nobody makes a sudden jarring movement. You never dare to test the integrity of the structure. You don't shake the table. You extract the blocks with breathless caution, praying the centre of gravity doesn't shift. Frankly, that is not the mechanism by which most enduring relationships manage to survive the decades. Real longevity requires flexibility, the capacity to weather emotional messes, and the ability to sit with tension without the immediate fear of total ruin. Yet Keith's rhetoric implied that total ruin was always just one wrong move away. And we must acknowledge a truth often ignored: strict rules are rarely drafted when everything is sailing smoothly. They are implemented when there is a beast to manage, a turbulent history to contain, and when trust is present but requires significant effort to maintain. Nicole spent vast amounts of time filming internationally while Keith was on the road touring relentlessly. Physical separation was a feature, not a bug of their lives. The threats of temptation, crushing loneliness, and the resurgence of old destructive habits were tangible dangers, not hypothetical scenarios. So in this light, the rules weren't about romance at all. They were calculated strategies for risk reduction, which isn't a moral failing, it is simply human nature, but it fundamentally alters how we perceive their union. Rather than a whimsical fairy tale, it resembles a highly effective long-term containment strategy. For years, the sobriety remained intact, the humiliating public scandals were kept at bay, and from the exterior, the family unit appeared to function perfectly. It worked. The lingering question remains: what is the internal cost of maintaining such a rigid scaffolding? When love transforms into a project you must constantly manage, rather than a sanctuary you can occasionally collapse into, a deep exhaustion begins to set in, particularly when one partner is hyper-aware of not pulling the fatal block. Keith famously noted that marriage demands constant work, which is an undeniable truth. Yet there is a massive distinction between the labour that builds a future and the labour required simply to prevent an imminent collapse. The strict no-texting policy loses its romantic sheen when you realise it likely exists to prevent disastrous missteps rather than to enhance deep connection. And that synchronised shower ritual feels far less poetic when you consider it may serve primarily to soothe separation anxiety rather than to celebrate true intimacy. That innocent childhood game of Jenga suddenly loses all its whimsical charm when you peel back the layers and recognise it for what it truly represents: a towering monument to pure, unadulterated anxiety. It is the paralysing dread that a single miscalculated twitch or a moment's hesitation could bring the entire meticulously stacked life crashing down in a pile of wooden rubble, undoing decades of careful preservation. Consider this uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the reason their union survived for 19 years wasn't because their love was effortless, but because they had both become master architects of avoidance, skilled at never disturbing the precarious sway of the tower. For nearly 2 decades, Nicole shouldered the immense burden of being the immovable anchor, while Keith bore the heavy, silent cross of the man perpetually seeking redemption for his past transgressions. These are rigid, suffocating archetypes that leave absolutely zero room for personal evolution once life moves past the adrenaline of crisis management and settles into the mundane. Sobriety may have given Keith his footing, and global superstardom may have insulated the family, but time merely polished the surface. The foundation itself was poured and set during a chaotic emergency. And as any structural engineer or psychologist will tell you, shelters built to withstand a temporary hurricane were never designed to serve as permanent residences for a lifetime of peace. So when the tabloids and fans gasp, wondering how such a seemingly bulletproof Hollywood power couple could suddenly fracture, the more astute question we should be asking is actually quite different. What inevitably happens when a partnership constructed entirely on a delicate high-wire balance finally hits that breaking point where one partner is simply too exhausted to keep moving the pieces with surgical precision? Because if you accept the premise that their marriage was always a high-stakes game of Jenga, then the eventual conclusion wasn't a shocking, out-of-the-blue collapse that nobody saw coming. It was simply the inevitable moment when one player looked at the wobbly tower and decided they no longer had the energy to keep the game going. And this brings us to a critical overlooked fragment of the narrative. If this fragile structure managed to hold steady for 19 years, why did gravity finally win? Now the answer lies in a 3:30 in the morning epiphany, proving that immense success always demands a steep payment. By late 2025, Keith Urban apparently decided he was finally ready to settle that bill. By then, the fairy tale narrative the public clung to had already begun to disintegrate behind closed doors. The marriage didn't end with a nuclear explosion. There were no screaming matches on the red carpet, no crockery thrown, and certainly no single defining headline moment that marked the end. Instead, the bond slowly unravelled in the lonely luxury of 5-star hotel rooms, on the sterile silence of tour buses, and during those hollow, sleepless hours when the applause dies down and you are left alone with your own echoing thoughts. Keith later characterised that specific era of his life with a stark, chilling phrase that stopped interviewers and fans dead in their tracks. He confessed that the glamorous life on the road, often romanticised by outsiders, had rendered him profoundly lonely and utterly miserable to his very core. That admission carries a weight far heavier than it appears, because touring is theoretically the environment where Keith is supposed to feel most vibrant, fueled by the roar of the crowd and the spike of adrenaline. For the vast majority of musicians, the grueling road schedule is exhausting but ultimately validating. Yet for Keith, it had mutated into something far more sinister and damaging. It became a vacuum where his monumental success served only to amplify his isolation rather than cure it, and the massive world tour of 2025 brought this into sharp focus. To the external observer, it was a triumph of sold-out arenas, military-tight schedules, and constant motion painting a picture of a career at its absolute zenith. But internally, that tour served as the physical manifestation of the emotional canyon widening between him and Nicole, a distance that finally became impossible to gloss over. Keith spoke with raw vulnerability about snapping awake at 3:30 in the morning while on tour, his eyes wide open, not due to jet lag or street noise, but because his mind simply refused to shut down. Those pre-dawn hours transformed into a brutal reckoning space, no band to distract him, no audience to perform for, no obligations to fulfill, just an oppressive, heavy silence. That is precisely when the terrifying realization crept in. He wasn't merely suffering from physical fatigue. He was deeply, structurally unhappy in a way that sleep could not fix. It was a profound, unsettling malaise that doesn't vanish after a day off at a spa or a particularly energetic show. It was a soul-deep weariness. It was the kind of existential crisis that forces you to confront whether the life you have so carefully constructed is actually compatible with the person you have evolved into. And here is where the contrast gets truly painful. While Keith was out on the road desperately chasing some form of creative momentum, reports suggest Nicole was struggling in her own right, not with public dramatics, but with a quiet emotional erosion. After years of serving as the emotional centre of gravity, years of contorting her own schedule, and years of being the unflappable rock, the toll was becoming visible. According to whispered accounts from those within their inner circle, the constant pressure had worn her down to a frayed edge. The very resilience and steel-spine strength that had once acted as the glue for the marriage had begun to weaken, and on some level, Keith could sense the shift. This highlights the cruel, tragic paradox inherent in long-term relationships that are forged in the fires of crisis survival and recovery. When the problem partner finally stabilises and begins to seek personal growth, the stable partner is often left standing amidst the wreckage, carrying the accumulated exhaustion of holding the sky up for years. Keith admitted that being away made him miserable, but the critical detail most miss is that returning to the sanctuary of home didn't magically repair his spirit either. His profound loneliness wasn't a symptom of geography or distance. It was a shadow that followed him everywhere, suggesting the root cause was a severe internal misalignment. If Nicole was the embodiment of safety, stability and survival, the open road represented the seduction of freedom, forward momentum and the chance for reinvention. For nearly 2 decades, these two opposing forces had managed to coexist in a delicate detente, balancing each other out. But by the time 2025 arrived, the forces were ripping in opposite directions. Keith was no longer fighting the war for sobriety, for that battle had long been won. He was no longer waking up every day trying to prove to the world and his wife that he could be dependable. He had already checked that box 1,000 times over. The haunting question confronting him at 3:30 in the morning wasn't whether he could survive another day, but whether he was permitted to desire something more than just survival. That is an incredibly dangerous, incendiary question to ask within the confines of a marriage that is built on a foundation of eternal gratitude. Because how do you look the person who literally saved your life in the eye and tell them that the life you share no longer fits your soul? How do you voice restlessness without sounding like an ungrateful villain? How does one go about chasing a new iteration of themselves without completely dismantling the bedrock foundation that made their current existence possible in the first place? Keith's misery wasn't an indictment of Nicole as a human being, nor was it a rejection of her love. It was a rebellion against the rigid roles they had both been trapped in for years, the eternal saviour and the perpetually redeemed, the stable rock and the grateful survivor. Those crisis management roles are fantastic when the house is on fire, but they spoil like milk once the smoke clears. By the tail end of 2025, the emotional accounting simply refused to balance out anymore. Keith has gone on record admitting that the relentless touring cycle left him feeling like a total stranger in his own skin, a confession that speaks volumes about his mental state. While most artists romanticise the open road as the ultimate form of escapism for Keith, it morphed into a brutal vanity mirror. The thunderous roar of the crowd only served to amplify the deafening silence of his own unhappiness once the lights went down. And we have to confront the most gut-wrenching truth of all. Sometimes true loneliness has absolutely nothing to do with physically being by yourself. It is the hollow feeling of staring into the mirror and failing to recognise the person staring back at you within the life you have curated. Nicole and Keith had constructed something objectively impressive. They had built an empire of family, unwavering stability, and a public narrative of ironclad endurance. However, simply enduring a situation is a far cry from actually finding fulfillment in it. When the initial emergency that glued you together finally evaporates, you are left stranded, forced to confront the fragmented parts of your own psyche that you conveniently ignored for years. The epiphany at 3:30 in the morning wasn't some cinematic climax. There was no press release, no breaking news banner. It was a creeping, solitary admission that the broken version of Keith Urban, who once needed rescuing, had left the building, and the man standing centre stage was someone else entirely. Coming to that realisation doesn't make anyone the villain in this story, but it absolutely forces you to make some impossible decisions. By every available metric, Nicole was emotionally bankrupted, completely drained, while Keith found himself trapped in a state of creative agitation and restlessness. Their marriage had transformed into the crash site where these two opposing realities slammed into each other, and no amount of strict rules, Sunday rituals, or therapy strategies could prevent the wreckage forever. This is precisely where the public gets the narrative wrong. Everyone is hunting for a smoking gun, a sordid affair, a massive scandal, or a single explosive fight. What they fail to see is the slow-motion erosion. We are talking about years of unspoken grievances and decades of swallowing compromises just to keep the peace. It was years spent bowing down to a version of their relationship that existed in the past, even as they were both actively outgrowing it in the present. When Keith described himself as lonely and miserable, he wasn't whining. He was offering a confession, an admission that his massive success finally bought him enough quiet time to hear the inner demons he'd been running from. And this leads us directly to the most uncomfortable elephant in the room question that nobody wants to ask. If Nicole Kidman was genuinely the love of his life, the one true pairing, then why did the sanctuary they built together start feeling like the loneliest prison cell he had ever known? Because the answer to a question that complex isn't found in the tabloids or in some cheap scandal. The answer lives in the tragic space where survival mode calcifies into stagnation and where gratitude quietly transforms into a gilded cage. And sadly, that is where this chapter must conclude. The final curtain call happened at age 58. On January 6, 2026, the legal tether binding them was finally severed. There were no theatrics, no screaming matches captured on security cameras, and no messy public allegations of infidelity to feed the gossip blogs. It was nothing more than paperwork cold, bureaucratic, sterile, and terrifyingly final. Yet buried deep within those legal filings lay the quiet, devastating reality of who these two icons had become after 19 years of reigning as Hollywood's golden couple. The divorce decree exposed a logistical detail that most headlines skimmed over, but to the trained eye, it is the most damning piece of evidence in the entire case. The custody arrangement for their teenage daughters wasn't a 50-50 split. It wasn't the standard week-on, week-off or alternating holidays that you typically see in a friendly separation. The math was absolute and jarring. Keith Urban is slated to spend a mere 59 days a year with his own children. Nicole Kidman, on the other hand, was awarded 306 days. That is not just a random statistic or a scheduling quirk. That is the blueprint of a fractured home. It is the physical manifestation of a father who had slowly transitioned into a guest star in his own family's life. 59 days. That averages out to barely 1 day a week. In the structural integrity of a 19-year marriage that is no longer a shared existence. It is a visitation schedule, plain and simple. It is a legal admission that the house was a headquarters for the mother and a glorified hotel stopover for the father. It reflects a harsh reality where Keith's existence was still orbiting the centrifugal force of tour buses, sound checks, and the addiction to the road's relentless momentum. Meanwhile, Nicole's universe was constructed around the heavy stationary anchors of domestic stability and consistent presence. This lopsided ratio tells the honest story that 1,000 perfect red carpet photographs never could. Custody agreements this specific never happened by accident or coincidence. They are the product of grueling, painful negotiations where one parent is forced to admit legally and on the permanent record that they simply cannot be there. It is the bureaucratic equivalent of hanging a closed for business sign on the door of the family unit. The court didn't just glance at his Google Calendar. They stared directly into the void that his absence had carved out over the last decade. When the dust settled, the judge didn't give a damn about Keith's Grammy collection or his status as a country music god. The court looked at his lifestyle choices. And that lifestyle, the one he actively chose to cling to at 58 years old, was completely incompatible with the family structure he had spent 2 decades claiming was his number one priority. This is where the tragedy of Keith's final confession comes into sharp focus. He never once claimed he stopped loving Nicole. Actually, he did the exact opposite. Even as the attorneys were drafting the documents for the 306-day split, Keith continued to use a language filled with reverence and awe. He referred to her as the definitive love of his life. Not an ex-flame, not just the woman who saved him back in the day, but the ultimate love. Period. But here is the secret truth that hurts the most. Love on its own is a terrible architect for building a functional life. The terms of the divorce made it undeniably clear that Keith had reached a fork in the road and made a conscious, agonising decision to walk away. Ultimately, he decided to trade domestic tranquility for perpetual momentum, preferring the deafening adulation of a packed stadium to the uncomfortable silence of a morning coffee at the kitchen table. He made a conscious, heartbreaking decision to inhabit the avatar of the rock star, that larger-than-life figure that only truly breathes when the stage lights are blinding and the crowd is screaming his name. The heartbreaking tragedy here is that back in 2006, Nicole had the power to pull him back from the brink because his substance abuse was a tangible external demon they could battle as a united front. In those dark days, the mission was stark, and vividly defined absolute sobriety was the only North Star, a clear crisis demanding a clear resolution. However, the intoxication of global fame operates differently than fentanyl. It doesn't ravage your body in visibly grotesque ways, but rather it lavishly rewards you on the outside while slowly eroding your soul from within. It acts as a slow-acting, seductive poison, gradually substituting the challenging, quiet work of marital intimacy with the instant, overwhelming gratification of 10,000 strangers chanting your name in the dark. This lifestyle injects you with a potent artificial sense of purpose that year after relentless year drags you further away from the ability to simply sit still and exist within a calm moment. By the time 2025 arrived, the equation had fundamentally shifted. Keith was no longer making a binary choice between his wife and the chaos of self-destruction. Instead, he found himself torn between the woman who held his heart and the high-octane adrenaline rush that had become the very foundation of his identity. Here lies the painful paradox. When he referred to her as the love of his life, he wasn't being dishonest. Rather, he was making a devastating admission of his own personal failure. It was his unspoken confession that even a love as monumental as theirs simply lacked the voltage to compete with the electric, addictive high of life on the road. That stands as the true gut-wrenching confession at 58 years old. Not that the romantic flame had been extinguished, but that he consciously preferred to chase the horizon rather than stay home and tend the hearth. This wasn't merely a man walking away from a legal union or a domestic partnership. He was abandoning the specific version of himself required to sustain that marriage. At 58, the emotional toll of being Nicole's Keith finally outweighed the price of solitude on a tour bus. And naturally, that monumental decision forces us to confront the most uncomfortable, lingering question of this entire saga. If the touring lifestyle offered him a liberation that his marriage could no longer provide, was it genuine freedom? Or was the road simply another dependency disguised behind a glamorous sequined mask? We have to talk about the addiction to the road itself, because true sobriety is about far more than just putting down the bottle. For a performer like Keith Urban, the hook was always the raw adrenaline of the crowd. Sure, after his stints in rehab, the illicit substances and the alcohol were banished from his system. But the addict's brain, that neural pathway, wiring that craves intensity, didn't just vanish. It adapted, it evolved, and the touring circuit became the new, socially acceptable fix. He traded drugs for the blinding lights, the deafening noise, and the transient validation that washes over you every night, only to evaporate by dawn. Except unlike heroin, touring is culturally celebrated. Society rewards this behaviour, framing it as artistic passion, but neurologically it hammers the exact same buttons in the brain. Massive dopamine spikes the thrill of escape and the allure of constant reinvention. On tour, you are never stationary long enough to confront your own restlessness or demons because the distraction of the next city is always just over the horizon. Nicole was able to drag Keith back from the edge of chemical addiction because it was visibly destroying his life, whereas the road was actively building his empire. That distinction made his career untouchable, leading to a cruel irony. The very mechanism that kept Keith sober might have been the exact wedge that made staying in the marriage impossible. Fame didn't come in like a wrecking ball and destroy their union overnight. Instead, it insidiously replaced deep intimacy with forward momentum, leaving us with one final haunting thought to ponder. If the touring lifestyle saved him from his inner demons but cost him the supposed love of his life, was that truly recovery or just a sophisticated, high-functioning form of addiction? Keith Urban spent the better part of 2 decades convincing the public and perhaps his own reflection that he was a transformed man. Now at 58, he has found his freedom, but he paid for it with the woman he once hailed as his saviour. In the end, was the love of his life merely another beautiful, complicated ballad that he just couldn't quite figure out how to finish? Drop your thoughts on this tragic situation in the comments section below.